A cop noticed a scruffy little puppy following him for blocks, never leaving his side. At first, he thought it was just a lost dog, but when he knelt to check its collar, he found something shocking, a crumpled note tucked inside. It was a desperate plea for help. The message was heartbreaking, and the moment he realized where it came from, his world shattered. Who wrote it? What was waiting for him at the other end? And why did this tiny dog refuse to give up? Officer James trudged down Madison Street, his feet heavy after a 12-hour shift. The streetlights cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalk, and the cool evening air did little to lift his fatigue. All he could think about was getting home to his warm bed. A soft padding sound caught his attention. He turned to see a small, scruffy dog following him. Its brown fur was matted and dirty. James waved his hand dismissively. "Go on, get home." The puppy tilted its head but kept following. Every few steps, James would look back, and there it was, maintaining a careful distance. Its ribs showed through its thin coat, and one ear flopped over while the other stood straight up. "I said, go home," James called out again, this time more firmly. The puppy stopped for a moment, then continued its determined pursuit. After half a block, James stopped walking and turned around completely. The puppy froze mid-step, watching him with wide eyes. There was something in those eyes, not just hunger or fear, but what seemed like desperation. "Listen, buddy, I can't help you. I'm not even supposed to have pets in my building," his voice softened despite himself. The puppy sat down right there on the sidewalk, its tail making tiny sweeps across the concrete. James ran a hand over his face and sighed. Something about the way the dog looked at him tugged at his heart. He knelt down slowly, extending his hand. The puppy flinched but held its ground, trembling slightly. "It's okay," James said softly. "I won't hurt you." As he moved closer, he noticed something around the puppy's neck, a worn leather collar barely hanging on. Tucked inside was what looked like a piece of paper, folded and crumpled. James carefully reached for it, speaking in soothing tones as the puppy watched him with those intent eyes. His fingers fumbled with the paper in the dim light. When he finally unfolded it, his breath caught in his throat. Written in shaky, childish handwriting were the words. "Help. My brother is sick. No food. No water. Apartment 3B. James' exhaustion vanished instantly. His heart began to pound as the urgency of the situation hit him. He looked at the puppy, who was now standing, tail wagging hopefully. Without another moment's hesitation, James broke into a run. The puppy bounded alongside him, leading the way with newfound energy. Their footsteps echoed through the empty street as they raced against time, guided by the desperate message and a brave little dog who refused to give up. The apartment complex loomed before James like a shadow from another era. Paint peeled from its walls in long, jagged strips, and several windows were patched with cardboard instead of glass. The puppy led him through the entrance, where a broken security door hung limply on its hinges. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered overhead, casting a sickly glow on the grimy hallway. The wallpaper, once probably cheerful with its floral pattern, now curled away from the walls in defeated strips. A musty smell hung in the air, mixed with something else James couldn't quite identify. His footsteps echoed on the cracked linoleum as he climbed to the third floor. Each step made his stomach tighten further, his police instincts on high alert. The puppy's nails clicked against the floor as it trotted ahead, stopping at a door marked 3B in tarnished brass numbers. James knocked firmly. The sound seemed to disappear into the heavy silence of the building. He waited, listening intently for any movement inside. Nothing. "Police," he called out, pounding harder this time. The door rattled in its frame, but still, no response came from within. Beside him, the puppy began to whine, pawing anxiously at the threshold. James tried the handle, finding it locked. The silence from within the apartment felt wrong, too complete, too heavy. Every instinct from his years on the force screamed that something was terribly wrong. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribs as he stepped back, evaluating his options. The puppy's whining grew more insistent. James made his decision. Taking a deep breath, he positioned himself and kicked hard next to the lock. The door burst inward with a sharp crack. The smell hit him first, a thick, oppressive mixture of unwashed bodies, spoiled food, and neglect that made him gag. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, the beam from the hallway light cut through the gloom like a spotlight. There, in the corner of what must have been the living room, he saw them. A small boy, no more than 8, sat pressed against the wall, his thin arms wrapped protectively around a bundle. A baby, James realized with a jolt. The older boy's eyes were huge in his gaunt face, reflecting the light like a frightened animal's. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. The baby in his arms was unnaturally still, save for the rapid rise and fall of its chest. Even from where he stood, James could see the flush of fever on the infant's face. The older boy pulled his brother closer, pressing himself further into the corner as if trying to disappear into the wall itself. His whole body trembled, but he never took his eyes off James, watching him with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. James slowly approached the children, his movements deliberate and gentle. He knelt down a few feet away, not wanting to frighten them further. "Hey there," he said softly. "I'm Officer James. I'm here to help." The older boy's grip on his brother tightened, his knuckles white with effort. When James reached out a reassuring hand, the boy flinched so violently that his head knocked against the wall. The puppy, sensing the tension, darted past James and went straight to the boy, its tail wagging as it began licking his face. The unexpected show of affection from the dog seemed to break through the boy's fear. His rigid posture gradually relaxed, and the trembling in his limbs began to subside. Tears welled up in his eyes, cutting clean tracks through the dirt on his cheeks. James pulled out his phone and dialed 911, keeping his voice calm and steady as he requested paramedics. While he waited, he conducted a quick survey of the apartment, his heart growing heavier with each discovery. The kitchen cabinets stood empty, their doors hanging open like hungry mouths. In the refrigerator, a single carton of expired milk sat on its side, long since curdled. A bare mattress lay in one corner, its springs visible through worn fabric. Nearby, a crib stood with soiled sheets, a few dirty bottles scattered around its base. James felt a lump form in his throat as he took in the grim scene. As he moved through the space, something in the trash can caught his eye, a crumpled piece of paper. He smoothed it out, his stomach dropping as he read the hastily scrawled words. "We can't do this anymore. No money. No jobs. We'll find help and come back. Just take care of your brother. Be strong." James's jaw clenched as he gripped the letter, the paper crinkling in his fist. The words rang hollow. These weren't the actions of parents desperately seeking help. This was abandonment, pure and simple. They had left their children to fend for themselves, the older boy forced to become a parent when he should have been playing with toys and going to school. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, the wailing growing louder as the reality of the situation hit James like a physical blow. These boys had no one, no family, no support, no one to care for them or keep them safe. As the flashing red and blue lights reflected off the apartment walls, James made a silent promise to the two small figures huddled in the corner. They wouldn't be alone anymore. The paramedics burst through the apartment door, their equipment rattling as they rushed to assess the situation. The younger brother lay motionless in his sibling's arms, his tiny chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. One of the medics gently took the baby, laying him on a portable stretcher. "Severe dehydration," the paramedic muttered to his colleague as he checked the infant's vital signs. "Possible organ failure. We need to move fast." The older boy's eyes widened with fear as they took his brother. He scrambled to his feet, his small hand shooting out to grab James's sleeve, his fingers twisting into the fabric, holding on with desperate strength. "It's okay," James assured him, placing his hand over the boy's. "They're here to help your brother. We need to let them do their job." The boy wouldn't let go of James's sleeve even as they made their way down to the ambulance. His legs trembled with each step, and James could feel him struggling to stay upright. Without hesitation, James scooped him up, carrying him down the stairs while the puppy trotted faithfully beside them. Inside the ambulance, the paramedics worked quickly on the baby, attaching 4 lines and monitoring equipment. James sat on the bench with the older boy pressed against his side, their hands clasped together. The puppy settled in James's lap, its brown eyes fixed on the boy with unwavering attention. The silence in the ambulance was broken only by the beeping of medical equipment and the occasional commands between paramedics. The boy's grip on James's hand tightened with each passing minute until finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "Is my brother going to die?" James squeezed his hand firmly. "Not on my watch, kid," he replied, his voice steady and determined. "These people are really good at their jobs. They're going to take good care of your brother." The boy nodded slightly, his eyes never leaving the small form of his brother on the stretcher. The puppy whined softly and stretched its neck to lick the boy's free hand, drawing a ghost of a smile from him. When they arrived at the hospital, everything moved in a blur of activity. The paramedics rushed the baby through the emergency room doors, rattling off medical terms to the waiting staff. The older boy tried to follow, but hospital personnel stopped him at the entrance to the treatment area. "No, no," he cried out, clinging to James even harder. "I need to stay with him. He needs me. The doctors need space to help your brother," James explained gently, kneeling down to the boy's level. "We'll wait right here, okay? I promise we won't leave." 2 women in business attire approached them, their badges identifying them as social workers. The older one pulled out a notepad, while the younger one smiled kindly at the boy. "We need to ask you some questions," the older social worker began, her voice professional but gentle. The boy pressed himself against James's side, trembling slightly. The puppy positioned itself between the boy and the social workers, its posture protective despite its small size. James looked at the social workers, taking in their clipboards and concerned expressions. He felt the boy's fingers digging into his arm, saw the fear in his eyes at the prospect of being taken away. In that moment, a decision began to war in his mind. He knew the system. Knew how kids like this could slip through the cracks, shuffled between foster homes, never finding stability. The boy had just lost everything, his parents, his home, his sense of security. James couldn't let him lose his brother, too. He made a silent vow to do whatever it took to keep them together. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room cast stark shadows across the worn vinyl chairs where James and the boy sat. The clock on the wall ticked away endless minutes, each second stretching like hours. The boy hadn't loosened his grip on James's sleeve since they arrived, his small fingers wound tightly in the fabric as if it were his only lifeline. James noticed how the boy's eyes darted nervously whenever hospital staff walked past. The puppy lay at their feet, its tail thumping against the linoleum floor in an anxious rhythm matching the tension in the air. Every now and then, it would raise its head and nuzzle the boy's ankle, offering silent comfort. "Are you hungry?" James asked softly, breaking the heavy silence. The boy shook his head, but his stomach growled loudly, betraying him. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a granola bar he'd forgotten about from his shift. "Here. You need to keep your strength up." The boy accepted it with trembling fingers, his other hand never leaving James's sleeve. He ate slowly, mechanically, as if he'd forgotten what food tasted like. Sarah Brooks, the social worker, sat across from them, occasionally glancing up from her paperwork. James could feel the weight of her presence, knowing that soon she'd have to do her job, following protocols that might tear these brothers apart. After what felt like forever, a doctor in blue scrubs approached them. The boy's grip tightened impossibly further on James's sleeve as they both stood up. Your brother is stable, the doctor said, his voice gentle but tired. He was severely dehydrated and malnourished, but we've got him on fluids and nutrition now. He's very weak, but he's responding well to treatment. The boy's shoulders sagged with relief, and James felt some of the tension leave his small frame. The puppy wagged its tail more vigorously as if understanding the good news. Before James could ask any questions, Sarah stepped forward, her heels clicking on the hospital floor. That's wonderful news, she said, then turned to face James and the boy. Now we need to discuss temporary arrangements. We have an emergency foster home ready to take both boys while we sort out the situation. The words hung heavy in the air. The boy's breathing quickened, and James felt him press closer to his side. The puppy stood up, sensing the change in atmosphere. No, the boy whispered, his voice cracking. His fingers dug deeper into James's sleeve as he looked up with desperate eyes. Please don't leave us. James looked down at those pleading eyes, then at Sarah, who waited expectantly with her clipboard. He saw the fear in the boy's face, the same fear he'd seen in that dark apartment, the same fear of being alone, of being abandoned again. The puppy whined softly, pressing against the boy's legs as if trying to hold him up. James felt the weight of the moment, the choice before him as clear as day. And in his heart, he knew he'd already made it. James pulled Sarah aside in the hallway, his heart racing but his voice steady. I want to foster them, he said, watching her eyes widen in surprise. Both of them? Sarah adjusted her glasses, studying him carefully. Officer James, I understand you feel connected to these boys, but fostering isn't something to take lightly. There's extensive paperwork, home studies, background checks. I know, James interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. I know it's not simple. But these kids need stability, not another temporary solution. They've been failed by enough adults already. Sarah tapped her pen against her clipboard, her professional demeanor wavering slightly. Do you truly understand what you're taking on? 2 traumatized children, one of them an infant, it's a huge responsibility. I've never been more certain of anything, James replied, his eyes never leaving hers. I can't explain it, but there's something about these boys. I can't walk away. In the hospital room, the boy sat cross-legged on the bed, the puppy curled in his lap. His small fingers stroked the dog's fur methodically, his eyes fixed on his baby brother in the nearby crib. The steady beep of monitors filled the quiet room. James returned with a paper bag full of food from the cafeteria. The smell of warm soup and fresh bread filled the air. He noticed how the boy's eyes followed his movements as he set out the food, watching him like a hawk. Here you go, buddy, James said, handing him a bowl of soup and half a sandwich. The boy accepted them carefully, as if they might disappear. James pretended not to notice as the boy quickly tucked half the sandwich under his pillow, his movements quick and practiced. It was a gesture that spoke volumes, the instinct of someone who'd gone hungry too many times. James felt his throat tighten but kept his voice casual. There's plenty more where that came from. You can eat as much as you want. The boy glanced at him uncertainly, then at the hidden sandwich before slowly pulling it back out. The puppy wagged its tail encouragingly. As night fell, the hospital grew quieter. The baby slept peacefully in his crib, his color already better after hours of treatment. James settled into the chair beside the boy's bed, watching as the child fought to keep his eyes open. The puppy had made itself comfortable on the bed, pressed against the boy's side like a furry guardian. James leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. I'm going to make sure you're safe, he promised. Both of you. The boy studied James's face in the dim light, searching for something. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because he gave a small, solemn nod. It wasn't much, but in that simple gesture, James saw the first glimpse of trust. The morning sun filtered through the hospital blinds, casting soft golden light across the sterile white walls. James had barely slept, keeping an eye on the boy and the baby throughout the night. Every time the boy stirred, he instinctively reached out for his brother, his small hand hovering protectively over the crib. The puppy had curled up at the foot of the hospital bed, its breathing steady, offering silent comfort. James stretched his stiff muscles and checked his phone. His shift was supposed to start in an hour, but there was no way he was leaving these kids alone. He needed to figure out the next steps. A light knock on the door broke his thoughts. Sarah, the social worker, stepped inside, holding a clipboard against her chest. "We need to discuss placement," she said, her tone professional but not unkind. James glanced at the boy, who was now sitting up, rubbing his tired eyes. The puppy wagged its tail, sensing movement. James exhaled and gestured for Sarah to step outside with him. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and brood. "I already told you, I want to foster them." Coffee. He crossed his arms. Sarah sighed, adjusting her glasses. "James, fostering isn't just a simple sign-up. There are protocols, procedures, and background checks. You live alone, and your work schedule is demanding. Raising an infant and a traumatized child is not easy." "I know that," James said, his jaw tightening. "But I also know the system. I've seen too many kids shuffled between homes, never feeling like they belong. I won't let that happen to them." Sarah studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "All right. I can put in an emergency request to have you as their temporary guardian while we process your application. But James, this is a big commitment. I'm ready for it." His voice was firm, leaving no room for doubt. Back inside, the boy sat quietly, his fingers gripping the hospital blanket. James walked over and crouched beside the bed. "Hey, buddy," he said gently. "I talked to Sarah. You're coming home with me, for now, at least." The boy's eyes widened slightly, flickering with something James couldn't quite identify. Hope. Disbelief. Fear. He hesitated before asking, "Both of us?" James nodded. "Yeah. Both of you." For the first time since they met, the boy's face softened just a little. His grip on the blanket loosened, and he let out a slow breath. The puppy barked once as if in approval. By the time the paperwork was signed and the baby was cleared for discharge, the sun had begun its slow descent. James carried the car seat with the baby inside, while the boy walked beside him, clutching the puppy's leash. His small fingers occasionally brushed against James's jacket, as if reassuring himself that this was real. The drive home was quiet. The boy stared out the window, his reflection faint against the evening sky. James glanced at him in the rearview mirror. He wanted to ask questions, his name, his favorite food, if he liked cartoons, but something told him the boy wasn't ready yet. So, instead, James simply said, "If you ever need anything, just ask." "All right." The boy nodded but said nothing. James turned onto his street, his modest house coming into view. It wasn't fancy, just a single-story home with faded blue paint and a small front yard. But it was safe. Warm. A place where no child should have to worry about going hungry or being alone. He parked the car and unbuckled the car seat. The boy hesitated on the sidewalk, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. James noticed the way his shoulders tensed, as if expecting something bad to happen. "Come on," James said, holding the door open. "Let's get inside." The boy followed, the puppy trotting beside him. Inside, James led them through the house, pointing out the important things: the bathroom, the kitchen, the living room. He had set up the spare room with fresh sheets and a bunk bed. He had even placed a few stuffed animals on the pillows, though he wasn't sure if the boy would care. "You can sleep here," James said. "Top or bottom bunk, your choice." The boy didn't move. He simply stood in the doorway, his hands clenched at his sides. The puppy looked up at him, then at James. "Is this real, the boy finally whispered. James felt something in his chest tighten. He crouched down to the boy's level. Yeah, kid. It's real. The boy swallowed hard and stepped inside. He didn't climb into the bed, though. Instead, he curled up on the floor beside the crib where the baby slept. The puppy settled against him, its body pressed close. James stood in the doorway, watching them. He ran a hand through his hair and sighed. This was going to take time. But he had made a promise. And he intended to keep it. James leaned against the doorframe, watching as the boy curled up on the floor, the puppy snuggled against his side. The sight made James's heart ache. A bed sat just a few feet away, warm and inviting, yet the boy had chosen the hard floor. Not out of preference, James realized, but out of habit. He exhaled slowly, stepping forward and crouching down. Hey, buddy, he said softly. The bed's a lot more comfortable, you know. The boy hesitated, his fingers curling into the fabric of the puppy's fur. His eyes darted toward the bed, but he didn't move. James didn't push. All right, he said, standing up. But if you change your mind, it's yours. The boy gave a small nod, barely noticeable. James grabbed an extra blanket from the closet, draped it over the child and the puppy, and turned off the light, leaving the soft glow of the nightlight on. Good night, kid, he murmured before stepping out of the room. The next morning, James woke to the smell of coffee brewing and the sound of soft, shuffling footsteps. He pushed himself out of bed, threw on a t-shirt, and walked toward the kitchen, where he found the boy standing awkwardly near the table. The puppy sat at his feet, wagging its tail, and the baby was still asleep in his crib. Morning, James greeted, keeping his tone casual. He noticed the boy's wide eyes scanning the kitchen as if unsure if he was allowed to be there. James reached into the cupboard and pulled out a box of cereal. You like Frosted Flakes? The boy gave the smallest nod. James poured 2 bowls, adding milk, and slid one across the table. The boy hesitated before sitting down. He ate carefully, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he expected the meal to be taken away at any moment. James didn't comment, but it made his chest tighten. You got a name, kid? James asked after a few moments of silence. The boy's spoon paused midway to his mouth. He swallowed, then answered, Noah. James smiled. Nice to meet you, Noah. He nodded toward the puppy. What about him? Noah glanced down at the dog, who was happily licking up a stray piece of cereal from the floor. A small furrow formed between his brows as if he had never considered naming the puppy. After a long moment, he mumbled, Hero. James grinned. Hero, huh? That's a solid name. The puppy barked in agreement, making Noah's lips twitch into something that was almost a smile. For the first time since meeting the boy, James felt a tiny crack in the walls Noah had built around himself. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Later that afternoon, James drove them to a local department store. Noah sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his hands clasped together in his lap, his eyes darting around the unfamiliar surroundings. When they walked inside, Noah flinched slightly at the noise of the bustling aisles. His fingers twitched toward James's sleeve, as if wanting to hold on to something but too afraid to ask. James steered them toward the clothing section. All right, kid. Pick out whatever you like. Noah froze. He stared at the racks of shirts and pants like he had just been handed an impossible task. James realized then that Noah probably had never been given a choice before. He cleared his throat and picked up a t-shirt with a cool rocket design. What do you think? Pretty neat, huh? Noah hesitated before nodding. James smiled and threw it into the cart. Okay, we're getting it. Slowly, Noah began to look at the clothes, his fingers brushing over fabrics as if trying to decide what felt safest. After some time, he picked out a few things, a hoodie, some jeans, socks. Each choice seemed to take immense effort, but James didn't rush him. At the checkout, Noah flinched when the cashier handed James the receipt. James noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way he braced himself as if expecting to be scolded. James crouched down beside him. "Hey. You did good, kid." Noah blinked, caught off guard. "I did?" James ruffled his hair lightly. "Yeah, you did." The boy stared at him for a long moment before finally looking away, a soft exhale escaping his lips. It wasn't a smile. Not yet. But it was something. That evening, James sat at the kitchen table, sifting through a mountain of paperwork. Fostering a child, especially on an emergency basis, came with a whirlwind of forms, background checks, and home assessments. He ran a hand through his hair, exhausted but determined. Noah and his little brother deserved stability, and he was willing to fight to give it to them. Across the room, Noah sat on the floor, playing quietly with Hero. The puppy nudged a small ball toward him, and Noah hesitated before rolling it back. It wasn't quite play, but it was progress. Every so often, his eyes flicked toward James as if making sure he was still there. James glanced at the clock. "Hey, kid. You want to help me with something?" Noah looked up cautiously. James held up a takeout menu. "Pizza. You pick." Noah's brows furrowed slightly, and James could tell he wasn't used to making choices. He hesitated before pointing to a simple cheese pizza. "Good choice," James said, placing the order. When the food arrived, James set the box on the table. "All right, let's dig in." Noah climbed into his chair hesitantly. He took small bites, chewing carefully. James noticed how he glanced at the leftovers, his fingers twitching as if debating whether he should hide a slice for later. "You don't have to save food here," James said gently. "Eat as much as you want." Noah stared at him, then at the pizza. After a long pause, he finally reached for another slice. James smiled. Progress. Later that night, after putting the baby to bed, James checked on Noah. He found him curled up on the floor again, Hero nestled beside him. The bed, untouched. James sighed. He walked over and sat on the floor next to him. "You know," James said, "when I was a kid, I used to sleep on the floor too." Noah turned his head slightly, just enough to show he was listening. "My dad was in the military," James continued. "We moved a lot. New houses, new places, nothing ever felt like home. So, I slept on the floor, because it was the only thing that stayed the same." Noah blinked at him in the dim light. James ruffled his hair lightly. "But after a while, I realized a home isn't about where you sleep. It's about who's there when you wake up." Noah didn't respond, but that night, he shifted closer to the bed. Not in it, but close. It was a start. The next morning, James woke up earlier than usual. The smell of coffee brewing filled the house, but it wasn't the coffee that caught his attention, it was the sound of Hero's paws tapping against the floor, followed by small, hesitant footsteps. James peered around the corner and saw Noah standing near the kitchen table, looking unsure of what to do. The boy had clearly woken up before James and, for the first time, had wandered into the kitchen on his own. "Morning," James said, keeping his voice light. "You hungry?" Noah nodded slightly. James noticed that his posture was a little more relaxed than before, still cautious, still guarded, but not as tense. Progress. James pulled out a frying pan and cracked a few eggs. "How do you like your eggs?" Noah hesitated before answering, scrambled. James smiled. "Good choice." As he cooked, he kept talking, not about anything serious, just small things to make Noah feel comfortable. He told him about his partner at the police station, about the time Hero had knocked over an entire bag of groceries, and about how he had once burned toast so badly that the smoke alarm went off. Noah listened quietly, but James caught the tiny flickers of amusement in his eyes. When the food was ready, he set a plate in front of Noah, along with a slice of toast and a cup of juice. "Eat up, kid." Noah took a bite, chewing carefully. James noticed he wasn't eating as slowly as before, wasn't hesitating like he used to. Another small step forward. After breakfast, James grabbed his keys. "Hey, I need to run a few errands. You want to come with me?" Noah looked uncertain but nodded. James smiled. "Let's go." They drove to the grocery store first. James grabbed a cart, and Noah followed closely behind. James noticed the way the boy's eyes darted around, scanning the people, the exits, the shelves stacked with food. It was clear that shopping trips weren't something he was used to. James handed Noah a small list. "Think you can help me find some of this stuff?" Noah hesitated, then took the paper. His small fingers gripped it tightly as if afraid of messing up. "Here," James said, pointing. "We need bread, milk, and peanut butter. Think you can grab those?" Noah nodded and slowly made his way down the aisle. James followed at a distance, letting him take his time. He watched as Noah scanned the shelves carefully, eventually selecting the items. When he brought them back to the cart, James smiled. "Nice job, kid." Noah glanced up at him, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that wasn't fear or hesitation. It was small, so small that most people wouldn't have noticed. But James did. Trust. After finishing their grocery shopping, James and Noah walked back to the car. James loaded the bags into the trunk while Noah stood beside him, Hero's leash clutched tightly in his hand. The puppy wagged its tail, sniffing at the cool air. As James shut the trunk, he glanced down at Noah. "You did good today." Noah shifted on his feet, his gaze dropping to the pavement. "I just got some food." "Yeah, but you helped," James said. "You made choices. That's important." Noah seemed to consider this, then gave the smallest nod. The ride home was quiet, but not uncomfortable. James let the radio play softly, a country song humming through the speakers. Noah stared out the window, his fingers occasionally brushing against Hero's fur. James didn't push for conversation. He was learning that Noah needed time to process things in his own way. When they arrived home, James handed Noah a lighter bag. "Here, help me carry this inside." Noah hesitated but took the bag, following James into the house. As they unpacked the groceries, James pointed to the fridge. "You can grab snacks whenever you're hungry, all right? You don't have to ask." Noah blinked at him. "I don't." James shook his head. "Nope. This is your home too." The words hung in the air between them. Home. Noah stared at the open fridge for a long moment before quietly placing a carton of milk on the shelf. That evening, James set up the living room for a movie night. He tossed some blankets onto the couch and made popcorn, the buttery scent filling the air. Noah sat on the far end of the couch, Hero curled up at his feet. James held up 2 DVDs. "All right, you get to pick, Toy Story or The Lion King." Noah's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "I get to pick." James grinned. "Yep. It's your call." Noah hesitated, then pointed to The Lion King. "Great choice," James said, sliding the disc into the player. As the movie played, Noah remained quiet, his eyes fixed on the screen. But James noticed the way his body slowly relaxed into the cushions. Halfway through, Hero climbed into Noah's lap, and to James's surprise, the boy didn't push him away. Instead, he gently rested his hand on the puppy's back. By the time the credits rolled, Noah's eyelids were drooping. James stood up and stretched. "All right, kid. Time for bed." Noah rubbed his eyes and stood up. He hesitated, glancing toward the floor where he usually slept. James saw the hesitation and spoke softly. "You know, the bed's still there if you want to use it." Noah didn't respond right away. He looked at the bunk bed, then at Hiro, who wagged his tail encouragingly. Finally, Noah climbed onto the lower bunk, pulling the blankets over himself. Hiro jumped up beside him, curling into a warm ball of fur. James smiled as he switched off the light. "Good night, kid." For the first time, Noah answered. "Good night, James." James paused in the doorway, a warmth spreading through his chest. It wasn't much. Just 2 words. But for Noah, it was a step toward trust. And James knew that sometimes, the smallest steps meant everything. The next morning, James found Noah sitting at the kitchen table before breakfast, something he hadn't done before. The boy still sat stiffly, as if unsure if he was allowed to be there, but there was no fear in his eyes. James placed a plate of pancakes in front of him. "Hope you like maple syrup," he said, setting the bottle down. Noah hesitated for only a moment before reaching out and pouring a small amount over his pancakes. James noticed how he took careful bites, but not as if he was worried about the food disappearing, just, slow, thoughtful. They ate mostly in silence, until James decided to ask, "So, what kind of stuff do you like?" Noah's fork paused for a second. "Stuff?" "Yeah," James shrugged. "Books? Drawing? Sports? Video games?" Noah chewed on his lip, clearly unused to being asked. "I used to read." James's interest piqued. "Oh yeah? What kind of books?" Noah shrugged. "I don't know. Ones with adventures, I guess." James smiled. "Good choice. We'll have to stop by the library sometime." A small flicker of interest flashed across Noah's face, just for a second. James took that as a win. After breakfast, James had errands to run. As they drove through town, he made an unexpected turn. "Where are we going?" Noah asked, his voice quiet but curious. James grinned. "You'll see." A few minutes later, he pulled into the parking lot of a bookstore. Noah stared at the building, then at James. "You said you liked reading," James said, shutting off the engine. "So let's get you some books." Noah hesitated before slowly unbuckling his seatbelt. They stepped inside, the scent of fresh paper and ink filling the air. James watched as Noah's eyes scanned the shelves, taking it all in. "Go on," James encouraged. "Pick whatever you like." Noah walked slowly through the aisles, his fingers lightly brushing the spines of books. It was clear he was overwhelmed, but in a good way. Eventually, he picked up a worn paperback and turned it over in his hands. James peeked at the title. "The Hobbit?" "Solid choice." Noah nodded and clutched the book to his chest. When they got back home, Noah didn't go straight to his room. Instead, he curled up on the couch with Hiro, the book already open in his lap. James watched from the kitchen, smiling to himself. The boy still had walls up, still had fears. But every day, he let James in just a little more. And that? That was everything. James leaned against the kitchen counter, watching as Noah sat curled up on the couch with his new book. Hiro rested beside him, his tail lazily thumping against the cushions. The sight brought a small smile to James's face. It was the most at ease he'd seen the boy since they'd met. The baby stirred in his crib, letting out a small whimper before settling again. James exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't used to having a full house, it had always been just him. Now, there were 2 kids and a dog under his roof, and strangely, it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt right. He grabbed a glass of water and took a sip before heading to the couch. "How's the book?" Noah barely glanced up but mumbled, "Good." James sat on the armchair beside him. "That's a classic. You like adventure stories, huh?" Noah gave a small nod. James leaned back, letting a comfortable silence settle between them. The sound of Hero's soft breathing and the occasional rustle of turning pages filled the air. James had spent years in a world of noise, sirens, radio calls, the endless chatter of the station. But this silence? It was nice. After a while, James stretched. "Hey, how about we do something fun tomorrow?" Noah finally looked up. "Like what?" James smiled. "There's a park not far from here. It's got a lake, walking trails, we could take Hero and have a picnic." Noah hesitated, his fingers gripping the edge of the book. "I don't know." James didn't push. "Think about it," he said casually. "No pressure." Noah nodded, his gaze drifting back to his book. The next morning, James woke up early and found Noah already sitting at the kitchen table. He looked as if he had been debating something all morning. James poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. "So, what's the verdict? You up for the park today?" Noah hesitated, then gave a small nod. James grinned. "All right then. Let's pack some food." Together, they made peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, packed a few snacks, and filled a thermos with lemonade. Noah was hesitant at first, unsure of what to do, but as James guided him, he started moving more confidently. It was another step forward. By mid-morning, they were on their way. The drive to the park was quiet but not uncomfortable. Hero sat happily in the back seat, his tongue hanging out as he looked out the window. When they arrived, the fresh scent of pine filled the air. The lake shimmered under the sunlight, and a few families were scattered across the grassy area, enjoying the warmth of the day. James led them to a quiet spot under a big oak tree. He spread out a blanket while Noah took Hero off his leash. The puppy ran in happy circles before stopping to sniff at everything in sight. James handed Noah a sandwich. "See? Not so bad, right?" Noah shrugged, but James caught the way his shoulders were more relaxed. After they ate, Hero took off running toward the lake. Noah stood up quickly, his eyes widening with panic. "Hero." James chuckled. "Relax, buddy. He just wants to explore." But Noah was already running after him. James followed, watching as Noah reached the edge of the lake and hesitated. The water lapped gently at the shore, and Hero stood ankle-deep, wagging his tail. Noah bit his lip, then slowly stepped into the water. Hero barked excitedly, splashing around. For the first time, James saw a real smile on Noah's face. Not just a small twitch of the lips, but a full, genuine smile. James stayed back, letting Noah have his moment. The boy played with Hero in the shallow water, his laughter light and free. It was the happiest James had ever seen him. Eventually, Noah turned back toward James, breathing heavily but smiling. "Hero likes the water." James grinned. "Yeah, I can see that." They spent the rest of the afternoon at the park. Noah was still quiet, but there was a lightness in him that hadn't been there before. When they finally packed up to leave, Noah glanced back at the lake one last time. James caught the look in his eyes, something wistful, something warm. It wasn't just about the lake or the park. It was about something bigger. It was about belonging. And for the first time, James had a feeling Noah was starting to believe he belonged somewhere, too. That evening, after returning from the park, James noticed something different about Noah. The boy moved through the house with a little less hesitation. He didn't flinch at sudden noises, didn't keep his hands clenched at his sides. There was a quiet ease about him that hadn't been there before. James set the picnic basket down on the kitchen counter. "You want to help me put this stuff away?" Noah hesitated, then nodded. He grabbed the loaf of bread and placed it in the pantry while James put the leftover lemonade in the fridge. Hero, exhausted from running around all day, flopped onto the floor, his tail wagging lazily as he let out a happy sigh. James ruffled the puppy's ears. "Looks like someone had fun today." Noah knelt beside Hero, running a hand down his soft fur. He likes the lake. James smiled. Yeah, I think you do too. Noah didn't say anything, but his lips twitched slightly, almost a smile. James counted that as a win. Later that night, after putting the baby to sleep, James walked into the living room and found Noah sitting at the dining table, staring at a piece of paper in front of him. His fingers curled slightly around a pencil, but he hadn't written anything yet. James pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. What's that? Noah shifted uncomfortably. Homework. James raised an eyebrow. Didn't know you were back in school. Noah hesitated, looking down. I'm not. Not really. But I used to like writing. James nodded slowly. You want to start again? Noah shrugged. I don't know. James leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. You know, sometimes writing helps. When I was younger, I used to write things down when I didn't know how to talk about them. Noah looked up at him. You did? James nodded. Yeah. Sometimes it's easier to put things on paper than to say them out loud. Noah stared at the blank page for a long moment before finally pressing the pencil to the paper. He didn't say another word, but James didn't need him to. He simply sat there, letting the boy take his time. The next morning, James got a call from Sarah, the social worker. I wanted to check in, she said. How are things going? James glanced toward the living room, where Noah sat on the floor playing with Hero. The boy wasn't smiling exactly, but there was something lighter about him. Something safe. They're going, James said honestly. He's still quiet. Still careful. But he's settling in. Sarah was silent for a moment. That's good to hear. But we need to start discussing long-term plans. James tensed. He knew this conversation was coming, but he wasn't ready for it. We'll need to start looking at potential foster homes, Sarah continued. Unless. James, have you given any thought to making this permanent? James's heart pounded. He had been avoiding that question, afraid of what it meant. But looking at Noah, he realized he already knew the answer. I don't think I can let him go, James admitted. Not now. Sarah exhaled. Then we'll start the process. James swallowed hard. This was real. This was happening. He glanced at Noah again, watching as the boy gently threw a ball for Hero. He looked happy. And for the first time, James allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could be the father this kid needed. James had never imagined himself as a father. His life had been structured around his job, the steady rhythm of shifts at the station, late nights with paperwork, and the occasional weekend spent catching up on sleep. But now, as he sat across from Noah at the breakfast table, watching the boy carefully slice his toast into tiny squares before eating, James felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just temporary anymore. He was committing to something bigger. Something permanent. Noah didn't know it yet, but James had already started the process to officially foster him and his little brother. The thought both terrified and excited him. So, what's the plan for today? James asked casually, taking a sip of his coffee. Noah shrugged. I dunno. James grinned. That's not an answer, kid. You want to go back to the park? Or maybe check out the bookstore again? Noah hesitated, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. Can we go to the library? James blinked, pleasantly surprised. Yeah, of course. You got a library card? Noah shook his head. Well, James said, pushing back his chair, we'll fix that today. The library was quiet, the air thick with the scent of books and polished wood. James watched as Noah moved through the aisles with a quiet kind of reverence, his fingertips trailing lightly over the spines of books. Hero sat patiently by James's feet, his leash wrapped loosely around James's wrist. A few people glanced at the dog, but no one said anything. Noah finally stopped at a shelf, pulling out a copy of Percy Jackson and the Olympians. He turned it over in his hands, flipping through the pages. James could see the flicker of excitement in his eyes. "You like mythology?" James asked. Noah hesitated, then nodded. James smiled. "That's a great series. I think you'll like it." They checked out the book, and James helped Noah sign up for his own library card. The boy clutched it tightly in his hands as they walked back to the car, as if afraid it might disappear. "You know," James said as he started the engine, "having a library card is a big deal. Means you're officially a member." Noah looked at him, eyes slightly wider. "A member of what?" James grinned. "The Secret Society of Book Lovers." For the first time, Noah let out a small chuckle. It was brief, barely more than a breath, but James heard it. And it was enough. That evening, after dinner, James pulled out a stack of papers from his bag. The official foster care documents sat on the kitchen table, staring up at him. His heart pounded as he flipped through them. This was it. The first step in making sure Noah and his brother stayed with him. He was about to sign when a small voice broke the silence. "What's that?" James looked up. Noah stood in the doorway, Hero at his side. James hesitated before answering. "Just some paperwork." Noah frowned slightly. "For what?" James exhaled, setting down his pen. "For you and your brother." Noah's fingers tightened around Hero's fur. "What do you mean?" James leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "It means I don't want you to go anywhere else, Noah. I want you to stay here. With me." Noah stared at him, his expression unreadable. "For how long?" James gave him a soft smile. "As long as you want." A silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile. Then, slowly, Noah walked forward, his steps hesitant. He didn't say anything, but he reached out and placed his hand over James's on the table. Just for a second. Then he turned and walked away, Hero following close behind. James watched him go, his chest tight. He picked up the pen and signed the papers. This wasn't just a temporary fix. This was forever. The next few days passed in a blur of routines that felt surprisingly normal. Mornings were spent making breakfast, afternoons at the library or the park, and evenings curled up with books or movies. Noah still wasn't a talkative kid, but James noticed the walls slowly coming down. The boy no longer hesitated before reaching for food, no longer flinched at sudden noises. He was settling in. And so was James. One afternoon, while James was at his desk going through some paperwork, Noah sat across from him with his book. Hero was curled up at his feet, content as ever. James glanced at Noah, watching as the boy absent-mindedly traced the edges of the library card in his hand. "You like having that, huh?" James asked. Noah looked up, startled for a moment, before nodding. "Yeah." James smiled. "Told you, it's a big deal." Noah hesitated, then quietly asked, "Do you have one?" James chuckled. "I did when I was a kid. Haven't had much time for books lately, though." Noah considered that for a moment before looking down at his own card. "Maybe you should get one." James raised an eyebrow. "You think so?" Noah nodded, his fingers tightening around the card. "Yeah. If you're gonna live here, you should have one." James stilled. The words weren't said casually. Noah had phrased it carefully. "If you're gonna live here." As if James was the one who needed to be convinced he belonged. James swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. "All right, kid. You got me. We'll get one next time we go." Noah looked satisfied with that answer and returned to his book. That weekend, James took Noah and the baby to a small festival in town. It wasn't anything fancy, just a few carnival rides, some food stands, and a petting zoo. But it was the kind of thing James figured kids should get to experience. As they walked through the fairground, Noah clutched the strap of his backpack tightly. He stayed close to James, his eyes scanning everything with cautious curiosity. James pointed toward a small booth. "You ever had cotton candy?" Noah shook his head. James grinned. "Then today's the day." They got a bag of the sugary treat, and James watched as Noah hesitantly took a piece, letting it dissolve on his tongue. His eyes widened slightly. "Good?" James asked. Noah nodded, quickly taking another piece. They wandered through the festival, trying different snacks and watching street performers. When they reached the petting zoo, Hero barked excitedly at the goats and sheep, his tail wagging like crazy. Noah, however, froze at the entrance. James noticed. "You okay?" Noah's fingers curled around the backpack strap. I don't like small spaces." James immediately understood. The pen was enclosed, the animals and people packed in close. It wasn't a tight space, but for a kid who had spent too much time in places that didn't feel safe, it probably felt like one. "You don't have to go in," James said gently. "We can just watch from here." Noah exhaled slowly and nodded. They stood outside the fence, watching as kids fed the animals. Hero, seeming to sense Noah's unease, pressed against his side. James gave the leash a light tug. "Come on, let's check out the games." Noah followed, his shoulders relaxing just a little. They spent the rest of the afternoon playing carnival games. James let Noah try his hand at the ring toss, and after a few failed attempts, the boy actually laughed when James missed just as badly. It was a rare sound, light and real. James wished he could bottle it. As the sun started to set, they made their way back to the car. Noah held a small stuffed animal, a prize James had won for him after too many failed attempts. He clutched it tightly, but his expression was soft. Content. James started the car, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. "Had fun today?" Noah nodded. "Yeah." James smiled. "Good. We'll have to do it again sometime." Noah hesitated for a moment before quietly asking, "Really?" James looked over at him, his voice firm. "Yeah, Noah. Really." Noah didn't respond right away, but he held on to the stuffed animal a little tighter. James knew that, for a kid who had spent his life being let down, promises didn't mean much. But James was determined to change that. One day at a time. James had expected Noah to crash the moment they got home from the festival, exhausted from the day's excitement. But instead, the boy sat on the couch, absently running his fingers over the soft fur of the stuffed animal in his lap. Hero lay beside him, his tail thumping lazily against the cushions. James sat down in the armchair across from them, stretching out his legs. "You tired?" Noah shrugged. "A little." James could tell there was something else on his mind. He had learned to read the small shifts in Noah's posture, the way his shoulders tensed when he was unsure of something. "What's up, kid?" James asked, keeping his voice light. Noah hesitated, his fingers tightening around the stuffed animal's paw. "Did you mean what you said?" James frowned slightly. "About what?" Noah swallowed hard. "About doing this again." James leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "Yeah, Noah. I meant it. We'll do plenty more fun things together." Noah stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Finally, he gave a small nod and looked down at the stuffed animal again. James let the silence settle between them before standing up. "All right, how about we make some hot chocolate before bed?" Noah's eyes flickered with interest. "Hot chocolate?" James grinned. "Yeah, you ever had it?" Noah shook his head. "Well, that settles it. Come on." In the kitchen, James set a pot on the stove and poured in some milk. Noah stood nearby, watching intently. "It's better homemade," James explained. "None of that instant packet stuff." Noah nodded as if filing the information away. James handed him a spoon. "Here, stir this while I get the cocoa powder." Noah hesitated but took the spoon, carefully swirling the warm milk around. James couldn't help but smile as he watched the boy take the task so seriously. Once the hot chocolate was ready, James poured it into 2 mugs and topped them with a handful of marshmallows. He slid one across the counter to Noah. "Moment of truth," James said, taking a sip of his own. Noah lifted the mug with both hands and took a cautious sip. His eyes widened slightly, and for the first time that night, a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. James grinned. "Good, huh?" Noah nodded, taking another sip. "Yeah." They stood in comfortable silence, sipping their drinks. James knew that for Noah, trust wasn't built in grand gestures. It was built in moments like these, small, quiet, steady. The next morning, James had an early shift at the station, but he hesitated before leaving. Noah was still asleep, curled up under the blankets, Hero nestled against him. James left a note on the counter, just in case Noah woke up before he got back. "Be back soon. There's cereal in the pantry. You're safe." The last 2 words weren't necessary, but James wrote them anyway. He wanted Noah to see them, to believe them. When he returned home that afternoon, he found the note still on the counter, but it had been moved. And beside it, in small, careful handwriting, Noah had written 2 simple words. "Okay. Thanks." James smiled to himself. Another step forward. James leaned against the kitchen counter, rereading Noah's response on the note. It was simple, just 2 words, but it carried so much weight. It was the first time Noah had voluntarily written anything to him. A silent acknowledgement that he felt safe. That he trusted James, even if just a little. James ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. He knew that trust wasn't something that could be rushed. Noah had been through too much. But moments like this? They mattered. Hero's paws clicked against the hardwood as he padded over, tail wagging. James crouched down to scratch behind the puppy's ears. "We're getting there, buddy." That afternoon, James decided to take Noah and the baby for another outing, something low-key, something normal. He settled on the local farmer's market, figuring it would be a good way to ease Noah into busier environments without overwhelming him. As they arrived, the smell of fresh bread and roasted coffee filled the air. Colorful stalls lined the streets, vendors calling out their daily specials, the hum of conversation blending with distant laughter. Noah stuck close to James, his fingers lightly brushing against Hero's leash. The puppy trotted happily beside him, oblivious to the tension in the boy's shoulders. James pointed to a stand selling fresh fruit. "You like apples?" Noah shrugged. "I guess." James grinned. "Come on, let's pick some." They walked over to the stall, where an older woman greeted them with a warm smile. "Afternoon, folks. Got some of the best apples in town." Noah hesitated before reaching out and picking up a deep red apple. He turned it over in his hands, inspecting it carefully. James watched him, noticing the small moment of consideration. It was just an apple, but to Noah, it was more than that. It was a choice. And choices were still new to him. "That one looks good," James said encouragingly. Noah gave a small nod and set it in the basket James was carrying. As they made their way through the market, James let Noah pick out a few more things, a loaf of fresh bread, a small jar of honey, some homemade cookies. He didn't push, didn't rush him. And by the time they left, Noah's grip on Hero's leash was a little looser, his steps a little lighter. That evening, after dinner, James noticed Noah sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through a small notebook. James wiped his hands on a dish towel and walked over. Whatcha got there? Noah hesitated before answering. I used to write stories. James raised an eyebrow. Yeah. What kind of stories? Noah shrugged. Different ones. Adventures. Some made up, some about, stuff that happened. James sat down across from him. You ever think about writing again? Noah's fingers traced the edge of the notebook. I don't know. James didn't push. Well, if you ever do, I'd love to read one someday. Noah glanced up, his expression unreadable. But after a moment, he gave a small nod. James smiled. Another step forward. Later that night, James was in his bedroom sorting through paperwork when a soft knock sounded on his door. He looked up to see Noah standing there, shifting his weight from foot to foot. What's up, kid? James asked, setting his papers aside. Noah hesitated, then walked in, holding his notebook in both hands. Without a word, he held it out to James. James took it carefully. You sure? Noah nodded, then sat on the edge of the bed, pulling Hero onto his lap. James flipped to the first page. The handwriting was small and neat, and the first few words made his chest tighten. Once there was a boy who didn't belong anywhere. No matter where he went, he felt like a ghost. He could walk through a room, and no one would see him. James swallowed hard, forcing himself to read on. But one day, the boy met a dog. The dog saw him. And even though no one else noticed the boy, the dog always did. And for the first time, the boy wasn't invisible anymore. James closed the notebook gently and looked at Noah. This is really good. Noah shrugged, his fingers curling into Hero's fur. It's just a story. James shook his head. No, it's more than that. He hesitated, then added, the boy, does he find where he belongs? Noah looked down at Hero and nodded. Yeah. Eventually. James reached over and squeezed Noah's shoulder lightly. I think he already has. Noah didn't say anything, but James saw the way his shoulders relaxed just a little. That night, for the first time since he had come to stay with James, Noah didn't sleep on the floor. The next morning, James woke up to the smell of bacon sizzling on the stove. He frowned, rubbing the sleep from his eyes before pushing himself out of bed. When he walked into the kitchen, he stopped in his tracks. Noah was standing on a step stool in front of the stove, carefully flipping bacon with a spatula. A plate with scrambled eggs and toast was already set on the counter. Hero sat obediently at Noah's feet, tail wagging as he watched the boy cook. James leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. Didn't know I had a chef in the house. Noah jumped slightly, nearly dropping the spatula. He turned around, his face tinged with uncertainty. I used to make breakfast sometimes. Before. James's heart tightened at the unspoken weight behind those words. Noah had probably been forced to take care of himself, and his little brother, for far too long. James walked over and ruffled Noah's hair lightly. Looks like you're better at it than me. Smells great. Noah hesitated, then carefully plated the bacon and slid the plate toward James. I made extra. James took the plate with a grin. Well, don't mind if I do. They sat at the kitchen table, eating in comfortable silence. Noah wasn't just picking at his food anymore, he was eating properly. Another small victory. Later that day, James decided to take Noah to the police station. It wasn't an official visit, just a chance for Noah to see where James spent so much of his time. When they arrived, James introduced Noah to a few of his co-workers. Officer Reynolds, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, crouched down to shake Noah's hand. You must be the kid James won't stop talking about. Noah's eyes widened slightly, glancing up at James. He talks about me. James smirked. Only good things. Reynolds chuckled. He's been bragging about how you're the best dog trainer in town. Noah blinked, looking down at Hiro, who sat proudly beside him. For the first time, Noah didn't look uncertain, he looked proud. James led him through the station, showing him around. Noah took everything in with wide eyes, but he stayed close to James's side. When they reached the K-9 unit's training area, Noah practically lit up. "You want to see how the police dogs train?" James asked. Noah nodded eagerly. James introduced him to Rex, one of the station's K-9 officers, and his handler, Officer Blake. As Rex demonstrated obedience commands, Hiro mimicked him, wagging his tail the whole time. Blake laughed. "Looks like you've got a future police dog on your hands." Noah beamed, scratching Hiro's ears. "He's smart." James watched the exchange, his chest swelling with warmth. This was what Noah needed: security, belonging, something to be proud of. That evening, after dinner, Noah sat on the couch, flipping through his notebook. James sat nearby, watching the news. After a while, Noah hesitated before speaking. "James?" James muted the TV and turned to him. "Yeah, buddy." Noah stared down at his notebook. "If I write more stories, would you read them?" James smiled, leaning forward. "Every single one." Noah nodded, his lips pressing together. Then, quietly, he said, "Okay." James didn't push for more. He didn't have to. Noah was finding his voice. And James was going to make sure he never lost it again. That night, as James turned off the lights, he heard a small shuffle from the hallway. He turned to see Noah standing by the door to his room, Hiro beside him. The boy's hands were curled into the fabric of his hoodie, his posture hesitant but not afraid. James leaned against the doorframe, waiting. "Couldn't sleep?" Noah nodded slightly. James gestured toward the couch. "You want to stay up for a bit? Maybe read?" Noah hesitated, then nodded again. James grabbed a book from the shelf and settled onto the couch. Noah sat at the other end, Hiro climbing up beside him. For a while, they just sat there, the only sounds being the turning of pages and the occasional sigh from Hiro. Then, out of nowhere, Noah spoke. "James?" "Yeah." Noah's fingers traced the edges of the book in his lap. Do you think we'll stay here? Me and my brother?" James's heart clenched. He set his book down and turned to face Noah fully. "I don't just think so, kid. I know so." Noah looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation. James held his gaze, letting him see the truth in his words. Finally, Noah exhaled softly. He nodded, then leaned back against the couch, pulling Hiro closer. James picked up his book again, but he wasn't really reading anymore. He was just sitting there, making sure Noah knew he wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, James woke up to an unfamiliar sound: laughter. It wasn't loud, but it was real. He followed the sound to the living room, where he found Noah sitting on the floor, Hiro rolling onto his back with his tongue lolling out. The baby, sitting in his bouncer nearby, let out delighted giggles as Noah playfully wiggled his fingers in front of Hiro's nose. James leaned against the doorway, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Having fun?" Noah startled slightly, but instead of freezing up like before, he just nodded. "Hiro's being silly." James chuckled. "Yeah, he does that." It was a small moment, but James knew better than to take it for granted. Laughter had been rare in this house before Noah arrived. Now, it was starting to feel like home. Later that day, James decided it was time to tackle something important: school. He knew Noah hadn't been enrolled for a while, and he wasn't about to push him into anything too fast. But the longer Noah stayed out, the harder it would be to go back. Over lunch, James set down a brochure from the local middle school. "So, I was thinking we could check this place out tomorrow." Just take a tour, no pressure. Noah stiffened, his fork pausing midair. I don't know. James nodded, keeping his tone casual. That's okay. We're just looking. No one's making you start tomorrow. But you're a smart kid, and I think you'd do great there. Noah fidgeted with the edge of his sleeve. What if the other kids don't like me? James leaned forward. You don't have to be friends with everyone. Just find one good person. That's all it takes. Noah was quiet for a moment before slowly nodding. Okay. Just a tour. James smiled. Just a tour. The next day, they walked into the school's main office. The secretary greeted them warmly, handing Noah a folder with some information about the school. The principal, a kind-looking woman named Mrs. Turner, gave them a tour of the classrooms, the library, and the cafeteria. Noah stayed close to James, his eyes scanning every detail as if waiting for something bad to happen. But nothing did. Kids laughed in the hallways. Teachers smiled as they passed. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't scary either. At the end of the tour, Mrs. Turner knelt down slightly to Noah's level. If you decide to join us, we'd be happy to have you. Noah nodded but didn't say anything. As they left the building, James glanced down at him. What do you think? Noah shrugged. It's okay. James chuckled. That's practically a glowing review from you. For the first time that day, Noah smiled. That night, as James cleaned up the kitchen, Noah walked in holding his notebook. He hesitated before setting it on the counter. James dried his hands and raised an eyebrow. Something for me? Noah nodded. I wrote another story. James smiled, flipping open the notebook. The words were carefully written, and as he read, his heart clenched. Once, there was a boy who never had a place to belong. He was like a stray dog, wandering, searching. But then, one day, he found a home. Not a perfect home, not a castle, but a real one. And in that home, he wasn't just a stray anymore. James swallowed hard and looked up. Noah was watching him closely, his fingers curled into his hoodie. James closed the notebook gently. I like this one. Noah's voice was barely above a whisper. Me too. James rested a hand on Noah's shoulder. You're not a stray anymore, kid. You're home. Noah blinked quickly and nodded. Then, before James could say anything else, he turned and walked back to his room. Hero trotted after him, tail wagging. James stood there for a long moment, the notebook still in his hands. Yeah. This was home. For both of them. The next morning, James woke up feeling more certain than ever, this was right. Noah belonged here. The baby belonged here. And somehow, without meaning to, James had built a family. He walked into the kitchen to find Noah already awake, sitting at the table with his notebook. Hero was curled up at his feet, snoring softly. The baby, still in his crib nearby, was just beginning to stir. Morning, James said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Noah looked up, hesitating for a second before replying, morning. James raised an eyebrow. That was new. Noah was starting to greet him first. Another small step forward. What are you working on? James asked, nodding toward the notebook. Noah ran his fingers along the edge of the pages. Just, writing. James didn't press. Instead, he took a sip of his coffee and sat down across from him. Thinking about school? Noah shrugged but didn't look as tense as before. Maybe. James nodded. Take your time, kid. No rush. That afternoon, they went to the park again. It had become their little tradition, James, Noah, the baby, and Hero. James brought sandwiches, and Noah brought his notebook. This time, though, something different happened. A boy around Noah's age approached, tossing a ball in the air. "Hey," the kid said, eyeing Hero. "Is he yours?" Noah looked at James, uncertain. James gave him an encouraging nod. "Yeah," Noah said quietly. "His name's Hero." The boy grinned. "Cool. I'm Lucas." He pointed at the ball. "You wanna play?" Noah hesitated, gripping his notebook. James could see the war in his eyes, fear of the unknown, of rejection. But then, slowly, Noah nodded. "Okay." James watched as the two boys ran off, tossing the ball back and forth while Hero chased after them. For the first time, Noah wasn't just observing the world from a distance. He was a part of it. James sat on the bench, sipping his coffee and watching them. The way Noah smiled, the way he actually laughed when Hero lunged for the ball and missed, it was the kind of happiness James had been waiting to see. A woman sitting on the next bench overglanced at him. "Is that your son?" she asked with a smile. James hesitated for only a second before answering, "Yeah. Yeah, he is." The words felt right. More right than anything had in a long time. That evening, as they walked back to the car, Noah was quiet, but James could tell it wasn't the bad kind of quiet. It was thoughtful. Lucas had invited him to come back and play again. And Noah had said yes. As they drove home, Noah spoke up. "James?" James glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Yeah." Noah looked down at his hands. I want to go to school." James smiled, warmth spreading in his chest. "Yeah." Noah nodded. "Yeah." James reached over and squeezed his shoulder lightly. "I think that's a great idea." For the first time, Noah wasn't just surviving. He was living. That night, as James was getting ready for bed, there was a soft knock on his door. He opened it to find Noah standing there, looking uncertain. Hero sat beside him, tail wagging lazily. James frowned slightly. "Everything okay?" Noah hesitated before stepping inside. He held his notebook against his chest like a shield. Noah shifted on his feet. "I wrote another story." James smiled. "Yeah." Noah nodded and held out the notebook. James took it and sat down on the edge of his bed, flipping to the newest page. There once was a boy who didn't know where he belonged. He moved from place to place, never staying long enough to call anywhere home. But then, one day, he found a man who didn't push him away. A man who let him stay. And for the first time, the boy thought maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. James swallowed the lump in his throat. He looked up at Noah, who was watching him carefully. James set the notebook aside and patted the space next to him. "Come here, kid." Noah hesitated, then slowly sat down beside him. James put a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone, Noah. Not anymore. And you never will be again." Noah's eyes shone slightly, but he didn't look away. Instead, he gave a small nod. Then, in a move that caught James completely off guard, he leaned forward and wrapped his arms around him in a quick, tight hug. James barely had time to react before Noah pulled away, looking embarrassed. But James just smiled, ruffling the boy's hair. "That's the best story you've written yet." Noah didn't say anything, but the corners of his lips twitched upward ever so slightly. That night, when James checked on him before heading to bed, Noah was asleep in his bed, not on the floor, not curled up in the corner. In his bed. Right where he belonged. James woke up to the sound of Hero's tail thumping against the floor. The puppy was sitting by the bedroom door, eagerly waiting for him to get up. James groaned and stretched before finally rolling out of bed. As he walked into the kitchen, he saw Noah already up, sitting at the table with a bowl of cereal. It was such a normal sight that for a moment, James just stood there, taking it in. "Morning," James said, grabbing a cup of coffee. "Morning," Noah replied without hesitation. That was new. James sat down across from him. "You sleep okay?" Noah nodded, stirring his cereal absent-mindedly. "Yeah. Another first." After breakfast, James decided to take Noah shopping for school supplies. They hadn't officially enrolled yet, but Noah's decision to go back was huge, and James wanted him to feel prepared. They walked into the store, and James grabbed a cart. "All right, buddy. You pick what you need." Noah hesitated. "I get to choose?" James nodded. "Of course. It's your stuff." Noah slowly walked down the aisle, his fingers grazing the notebooks, pencils, and backpacks. He picked up a simple black notebook, flipping through the blank pages. "You like that one?" James asked. Noah nodded. "Then it's yours." James tossed it into the cart. Little by little, Noah started picking out supplies, a pack of pens, a binder, a set of colored pencils. He moved carefully, as if he wasn't sure he was allowed to take too much. James let him take his time. When they reached the backpack section, Noah stopped in front of a dark blue one with a small lightning bolt design. He reached out, then quickly pulled his hand back. "You want it?" James asked. Noah hesitated. "It's nice." James grabbed the bag off the hook and handed it to him. "Then it's yours." Noah looked up at him, uncertainty still in his eyes. "Really?" James crouched down to his level. "Noah, you're starting school soon. You deserve to have nice things. This is all for you." Noah clutched the backpack, nodding slowly. "Okay." James smiled. They were getting there. That evening, after putting the baby to sleep, James found Noah sitting on the couch, his new notebook in his lap. "What are you writing?" James asked, settling into the chair beside him. Noah hesitated before flipping the notebook around. "It's a list." James raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" Noah looked down at the page. "Stuff I want to do." James leaned forward. "Can I see?" Noah nodded, and James took the notebook. The handwriting was small but neat. "Things I want to do. Go to school. Make a friend. Learn how to swim. Read a big book. Have a real birthday party. Keep Hero forever." James's heart clenched as he read the list. He glanced at Noah. "These are great goals." Noah fidgeted slightly. "Do you think I can do them?" James smiled and ruffled his hair. "I don't think so, kid." "I know so." Noah exhaled, nodding. Then, after a moment, he added something to the list. "Stay here." James swallowed hard. He pulled Noah into a one-armed hug, squeezing his shoulder. "That one's already checked off." Noah didn't pull away. Instead, he let himself lean into James for just a second before pulling back. "Okay." James smiled. "All right, kid. First thing on the list, school. You ready?" Noah nodded, a small smile forming. "Yeah." The next morning, James felt a strange mix of excitement and nerves. Today was a big day, Noah's first day back at school. He wasn't sure how the boy was feeling, but James knew it was a huge step. When he walked into the kitchen, Noah was already dressed, his new backpack sitting on the chair beside him. He was staring at his cereal, stirring it slowly but not eating. Hero lay curled at his feet, tail flicking every so often. James poured himself some coffee and leaned against the counter. "Nervous?" Noah nodded slightly but didn't look up. James took a sip of coffee. "That's normal, kid. First days are always weird." Noah finally spoke, his voice quiet. "What if they don't like me?" James set his mug down and walked over, crouching beside him. "Listen, you don't have to impress anyone. Just be yourself. And if someone doesn't like you, that's their loss. Noah still looked uncertain. James thought for a moment, then smirked. Besides, if anyone gives you trouble, just tell them you've got a cop and a dog on your side. That earned him a small chuckle. Hero's not that scary. James ruffled Noah's hair. Maybe not. But he's loyal. Just like me. Noah took a breath, then nodded. Okay. The school drop-off was smoother than James expected. Noah was quiet on the way there, staring out the window. When they arrived, he hesitated, gripping the straps of his backpack tightly. James gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. You got this, kid. Noah nodded, then, after a moment of hesitation, stepped out of the car. James watched as he walked toward the building. Just before disappearing inside, Noah turned back and gave a small wave. James smiled and waved back. The house felt strangely empty without Noah there. James spent the day catching up on work and taking care of the baby, but he found himself glancing at the clock every so often, counting down the hours until school ended. When it was finally time, he drove back to pick Noah up. He spotted the boy walking out of the building, his new backpack slung over one shoulder. Lucas, the boy from the park, was walking beside him. James raised an eyebrow. That was unexpected. Noah climbed into the car, setting his backpack down at his feet. James started the engine. So? Noah shrugged. It was okay. James glanced at him. Just okay. Noah hesitated, then admitted, I sat with Lucas at lunch. James grinned. Oh yeah? Sounds like you made a friend. Noah fiddled with the zipper of his backpack. Maybe. James didn't push, but his chest swelled with pride. This was huge. That evening, after dinner, Noah sat at the kitchen table, his notebook open in front of him. James sat across from him, pretending to read the newspaper but really just waiting for Noah to say something. After a long pause, Noah picked up his pencil and added a new line to his list. Made a friend. James smiled but didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Noah was beginning to believe in himself. And that was all that mattered. The next morning, James woke up to the sound of movement in the kitchen. He pulled on a hoodie and walked out to find Noah standing at the stove, carefully pouring pancake batter into a pan. The boy's face was focused, determined. Morning, Chef, James said, leaning against the counter. Noah glanced up briefly but didn't stop what he was doing. Morning. James raised an eyebrow. You know, I could get used to waking up to breakfast already being made. Noah smirked slightly, flipping a pancake. Hero helped. James looked down at the puppy sitting expectantly near Noah's feet, watching the pan like it held the secret to life itself. James chuckled. I'm sure he did. They ate breakfast together, and James noticed something different about Noah. He wasn't just answering questions anymore, he was starting conversations. Asking about James's work, about what kind of books he liked when he was younger. It wasn't much, but it was another step. That afternoon, Noah was in his room, working on something in his notebook when James knocked lightly on the door. Hey, kid. Feel like going for a drive? Noah looked up. Where? James smiled. Surprise. Noah hesitated, then nodded. Okay. They piled into the truck with Hero in the back seat, panting happily. James drove out of town, eventually turning onto a winding road surrounded by tall trees. When they pulled up to a small lake, Noah looked around, curious. What is this place? James turned off the engine. Figured we'd start checking things off your list. Noah blinked, confused. My list? James grinned. You said you wanted to learn how to swim, right? Noah's eyes widened. Yeah, but, now. No time like the present. James grabbed a couple of towels from the truck. Come on. Noah hesitated for a moment before climbing out of the car. He followed James down to the dock, eyeing the water nervously. You don't have to go in if you're not ready, James said gently. We can just sit by the water. Noah swallowed, his hands gripping the hem of his shirt. No. I wanna try. James nodded. All right. We'll take it slow. They stepped into the water together, Hero barking excitedly from the shore. At first, Noah was tense, gripping James's arm tightly. But after a few minutes, he started to relax, letting himself float with James holding onto him. After a while, James let go just a little. You're doing it, kid. Noah's face lit up. I am. James laughed. Yeah, you are. For the first time, Noah wasn't just existing, he was experiencing. Once they got out of the water, James spread out a towel for Noah to sit on while they dried off. The boy sat with his knees tucked to his chest, looking out at the lake. James handed him a bottle of water. How do you feel? James asked. Noah took a sip before answering. Good. I thought it'd be scarier. James smiled. Most things aren't as scary as they seem once you actually try them. Noah nodded thoughtfully, watching as Hero splashed around in the shallows. Then, he turned to James. What about you? James frowned slightly. What about me? Noah hesitated, then asked, do you have things you're scared of? James leaned back on his hands, staring up at the sky for a moment before answering. Yeah, of course. Everyone does. Noah studied him. Like what? James sighed. Losing people. Noah looked down at his hands. Yeah, me too. James placed a firm hand on Noah's shoulder. Well, you're not losing me. Or Hero. Or your little brother. We're not going anywhere, okay? Noah's grip on his towel tightened, but he nodded. Okay. That night, when they got home, James walked past Noah's room and saw him add another line to his list. Learned how to swim. Then, after a pause, Noah added something else. Trusting people again. James leaned against the doorframe, watching silently as Noah set his notebook aside and curled up under his blanket. One step at a time. The next few days passed in a blur of small victories. Noah continued to settle into his new routine, going to school, playing with Lucas at the park, writing in his notebook. Every night, James would find Hero curled up beside him, the boy's breathing steady and peaceful. It was a sight that never failed to warm James's heart. One evening, after dinner, James leaned back in his chair and stretched. All right, kid. We've checked a few things off your list. What's next? Noah bit his lip, flipping open his notebook. A real birthday party, he mumbled. James raised an eyebrow. When's your birthday? Noah hesitated. It was last month. James's stomach twisted. You didn't celebrate? Noah shook his head. I never really did. James exhaled, rubbing his jaw. Well, that's about to change. Noah looked up, confused. But it's already passed. James grinned. So? We'll just do a late birthday party. No rules against that. Noah blinked, clearly unsure how to react. I don't know. I've never had one before. James clapped a hand on his shoulder. Then we'll make it one to remember. The next day, James started planning. He reached out to Lucas's parents, who were more than happy to bring him over. Then he called Sarah, the social worker, to ask if she could drop by with Noah's little brother for the party. She agreed immediately. James took Noah to the store and let him pick out decorations. At first, Noah was hesitant, overwhelmed by the bright balloons and endless choices. But after a few minutes, he carefully picked out a few things, a banner, some blue and silver streamers, and a pack of confetti. "What kind of cake do you want?" James asked. Noah shrugged. "I don't know." James crouched beside him. "What's your favorite flavor?" Noah hesitated, then mumbled, "Chocolate." James grinned. "Good choice. Chocolate it is." On the day of the party, James woke up early to set everything up. He hung the decorations, set out snacks, and placed the cake in the center of the table. Noah hovered nearby, watching silently. "You excited?" James asked. Noah shifted on his feet. "A little." James could tell he was nervous. This was all new to him. But James was determined to make sure it would be a day he'd never forget. When the guests arrived, Noah seemed overwhelmed at first. Lucas ran up to him with a wrapped gift, grinning. "Happy late birthday." Noah hesitated before taking the present. "Thanks." Sarah arrived shortly after with the baby, who squealed happily when he saw Noah. Noah immediately took him from her arms, holding him close. James watched as the boy softened, his walls momentarily dropping. As the afternoon went on, Noah began to relax. They played games, ate cake, and for the first time, Noah truly laughed, loud and unrestrained. When it was time for presents, he opened Lucas's gift first, a set of sketchbooks and colored pencils. Noah ran his fingers over the cover of the sketchbook. "Thanks," he said again, but this time, his voice was stronger. James handed him another gift. "This one's from me." Noah opened it and froze. Inside was a framed picture of the two of them, with the baby in Noah's arms and Hero sitting at their feet. James had taken it a few days ago, printing and framing it just for this moment. Noah's fingers tightened around the frame. He swallowed hard, looking up at James. "It's us." James nodded. "Yeah, kid. It's us." Noah didn't say anything, but after a few seconds, he carefully set the frame aside and did something that nearly broke James. He hugged him. James wrapped an arm around the boy's shoulders, squeezing gently. "Happy birthday, Noah." For the first time, Noah whispered, "Thank you." James smiled, holding him just a little tighter. Noah had a home. A family. And now, finally, he had a birthday to remember. The warmth of Noah's hug lingered in James's heart long after the party ended. As the guests trickled out and the house quieted down, Noah sat on the couch, Hero curled up beside him, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edges of the framed photo. James walked over and sat down next to him. "So, how was your first real birthday party?" Noah was silent for a moment, staring down at the picture. Then, quietly, he said, "It was the best day ever." James swallowed the lump in his throat, ruffling the boy's hair. "Good. That's how birthdays should be." Noah glanced up at him. "Did you have parties when you were a kid?" James chuckled. "Not really. My dad was in the military, so we moved around a lot. But my mom always made a big deal out of birthdays. Cake, presents, the works." Noah nodded, then looked back at the picture. "I didn't think birthdays mattered before." James nudged his shoulder. "They do when you have people who care about you." Noah's grip on the frame tightened slightly. "Yeah." The next morning, James found Noah sitting at the kitchen table, writing in his notebook. He poured himself some coffee before sitting across from him. "Working on another story?" Noah shook his head. "Just my list." James smiled. "Let's see what we've got." Noah turned the notebook around so James could read it. "Things I want to do. Go to school. Make a friend. Learn how to swim. Read a big book. Have a real birthday party. Keep Hero forever. Stay here." James's heart clenched at the last checkmark. He tapped the page. "Looks like you're running out of things to do." Noah hesitated, then picked up his pencil and carefully wrote. Call this home. James exhaled slowly. He reached across the table, squeezing Noah's wrist gently. You know, kid. I think you already have. Noah met his gaze, a small smile tugging at his lips. Yeah. I think so too. James grinned. So what's next? Noah thought for a moment, then slowly wrote the next line. Be happy. James leaned back, smiling softly. I like that one. Noah nodded. Me too. And for the first time, James knew, with absolute certainty, that Noah wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. He was home. And they had all the time in the world to make sure he stayed that way. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.